Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to another Listen with Vobes. I'm Richard Vobes. Sorry about the slight delay there, as I was just getting myself organised. I hope there is no buffering, by the way. I've had to just reduce the bit rate of the stream, which won't mean anything to most people, but so if it's the quality isn't brilliant, I'm just uploading tomorrow's Bald Explorer video, and the crossover between this show and then has just sometimes it does happen. So I'm hoping we don't have any buffering, but it'll only be uploading for 15 more minutes. So it's just nice to get it done, because if I wait till later on, it takes much longer, because America is more awake and the more of the YouTube creators are uploading their videos all over America, and so it then takes longer to upload. So that's why I try to get the upload done so I don't have to worry about it, basically. Anyway, that's all nonsense. Hello and welcome to Listen with Vobes. We are, of course, reading London Belongs to Me by Norman Collins, and it's a fascinating read. It's 4 o'clock here in the UK. Could be a different time where you are. And I'll just say a few hellos. Hello to the lovely viewers who are watching. We have the lovely Julia. Good afternoon to you. Turbo Stream from a windy and chilly Shire, he says. Alison O'Brien is there. Lovely sunny day. We've had a sunny day down here in Worthing, I have to say, and out where I was near Haywards Heath. Audrey Forbes Hamilton, good afternoon. Blustery old ray of sunshine here. Jen Colley says, I took my dogs along the beach today and saw plenty of gulls, but no sea eagles. Oh, that's a shame. Billabong O'Neill says, hi, everyone. Zoom Coco is here. Everyone, great to see the sunshine. Sensible Paul has arrived. Dave Evad. Hello, Voblings. Michael White. Anne H. Nigel Sadler. Dudley Sawyer, good afternoon to you. And about 25 frames out, so quite acceptable. Sorry about that. Oh, 2 to 3 frames. Sorry, my eyes were just going a bit pokey-wokey. Yeah, I just reduced it down to 2,000... whatever it is, kilobytes per second upload. So slightly good, but hopefully it will sort itself out. Linda Kane, good afternoon. What a glorious day. And Julia is welcoming everyone with tea and coffee to the left, biscuits and cake to the right. Help yourselves and get comfy. Thank you. I will. In fact, I do have my little taxi cup of tea here. It's I've gone back to the usual of whatever it is I do, the ginger and lemon. Sometimes I do lemon and ginger, but today it's ginger and lemon. So that will be good. And we're all set, really. We're all set. Just waiting for the lovely Philip and Mary Hammond, who have yet to arrive, because, ladies and gentlemen, I have 2 more tank tops have arrived, which I have purchased from the lovely Mary Hammond, one in yellow and one in teal. So I hope that looks all right. Anyway, if you see them arrive, if they turn up today, do say thank you very much on my behalf. If I miss them, I will do my best. I'm sure to have ginger beer available next time. Oh yes, ginger beer would be nice. I do like ginger beer. Homemade ginger beer, preferably, rather than the shop bought stuff. We are on chapter 15, ladies and gentlemen. I hope you can hear me all right. I think my volume is a bit low. There we go. Is that better? 1, 2, 3, 4. There, that's much better. All waiting, 4 kids, wife and myself, says Skillet. Hello to Skillet family. I don't know wife and 4 kids as names, but I hope you're all going to behave yourselves and sit quietly. So that would be good. Are you wearing a smoking jacket? It's a velvet jacket, actually. It is. I don't know if you can see that under this light. It's very difficult to tell, but it's a beautiful jacket. I bought it yonks ago, and I rarely wear it. But it's got a sort of paisley inside. Look at that. I just wanted something that worked with the yellow. This isn't yellow. With the teal, and my blue jacket. You know, my Harris Tweed blue wouldn't work. I had another one. What colour jacket was I? Oh, I had a greeny jacket. That doesn't work. So I thought I'll have to put this one on. So there we go. Anyway. Nice cuffs. Where are the cuffs? There's a cuff. Right, let's get on with this because people are waiting. Sorry about the delay. Nigel Sadler is, yeah. Chapter 15. It was a Saturday, the day of Doris's move. After dawning, hopefully, with a clear sky, it clouded over by breakfast time, and by 10 o'clock it was raining. The rain was still coming down by midday, and at 12:30, when the move was due to begin, it was a downpour. Because the furniture had to arrive from 2 different places, it was complicated enough anyhow. Scouts had been posted at Kennington, West Hampstead and Adelaide Road in an attempt to synchronise the various movements of the furniture. And, even so, things went wrong. In the first place, the van that was calling at West Hampstead for Doreen's settees and cushions and mirrors arrived early, and the van that was collecting Doris's solider stuff from Kennington arrived late. This meant that Doreen's boudoir was already in situ, drawn up alongside the curb in the rain, while Doris's bedroom was still trundling over Lambeth Bridge on its journey northwards. It was Mrs. Smythe's, Doreen's mother, who had agreed to act as coordinator. A large, imposing woman who always wore pearls, big pinkish ones for preference. She had promised herself an easy, rather queenly afternoon, simply presiding in the flat until the girls had arrived. But unfortunately, things weren't working out that way. There was a sudden rush in the office, and there was Doris and Doreen hammering away at their typewriters when when they should have been lugging chairs about and trying out the new window curtains. In the end, they got off at 1:15, ate a sandwich in the milk bar, drank a foaming raspberry drink called a special, and fought their way onto a number 31 bus to Chalk Farm. They were both of them very excited, very impatient and slightly apprehensive. They arrived to find a row going on with the moving men from West Hampstead. It was the iron staircase that was the cause of the trouble. Apparently, the estimate would have been different if the firm had known about the staircase, and, from the way the men spoke, they made it clear that the difference would have been in blood money. Nor were the men from Kennington any more encouraging when they turned up. They were dark, soured little fellows, and they had all the heavier pieces. They kept going round the back of the house to have another look at the staircase, and each time they returned, they were shaking their heads. Then the foreman said something about tackle, and the 2 teams went into a huddle to discuss it. The main difficulty seemed to be that neither side had brought any tackle with them, and they were clearly in favour of calling off the whole operation and going home quietly. It was Mrs. Smythe who finally overawed them into action. They emerged from their interview with her with the appearance of men who had drawn lots and had lost both. Or rather, both had lost. They turned up their collars, their coat collars, and inverting their pipes to keep the raindrops from spoiling their tobacco, consented to climb up aloft once more and see for themselves. Mrs. Smythe put up the umbrella and climbed with them. It was her second view of the inside of the flat, and it confirmed her first one. She was horrified. It seemed incredible, It seemed incredible that because of Doreen's mad infatuation for this girl from South London, her daughter should be sentencing her life to live in a place. Oh, golly, hang on, let me have a slurp because I'm not doing very well. I probably need to slow down. It seemed incredible that because of Doreen's mad infatuation for this girl from South London, her daughter should be sentencing herself to live in such a place. She kept on glancing at the painted window with the sloping windowsill and glancing away again. But at least it was dry. After the streaming rain that had slanted down the outside staircase, even the bare boards and the discoloured walls of the flat seemed luxurious. And from so much security, Mrs. Smythe refused altogether to be budged. She simply begged the men to hurry, telling them that they could see for themselves that the odd staircase, the outside staircase, was nothing, and stayed where she was. After another pause that drove Doreen nearly frantic, she didn't attempt to... Sorry, he keeps putting in these little hyphen things and I get confused on that. After a pause that drove Doreen nearly frantic, she didn't attempt to conceal that she blamed Mrs. Smythe for the delay. The moving men came staggering up like small storming parties. The furniture had been swathed in layers of dust cloths to protect it from the rain, and wet figures appeared suddenly in the doorway carrying large, shapeless cocoons. It was here that Doreen's nervous energy showed itself. She rushed at the men as though attacking them, and she began tearing the winding cloths off the furniture. A moment later, she was trundling chairs and settees across the floor and standing back with half-closed eyes to see how the room looked that way. By 4 o'clock, the last of the storming parties had retreated, and only the hard work of getting things tidied up remained. Here, Doreen suddenly went under. Probably as a result of too much effort, one of her headaches had come on. Whatever it was, whatever caused it, it came and laid her out. All the time, while Doris was opening packing cases and trying to get into the kitchen and make it in order, poor Doreen couldn't do a thing. She just lay back on her own settee with her own cushion under her head, giving advice and promising to help as soon as she was recovered. She was still lying there when Mrs. Josser arrived. Doris hadn't told Doreen anything about Mrs. Josser's visit, and Doreen seemed to resent it. When at first she found that Mrs. Josser had brought tea with her, she was carrying a large wicker basket full of cake and buns and biscuits, as well as a bottle of milk and a bag of sugar, Doreen, who was feeling hungry by now, softened a little in her attitude. She recognised that in a humble, rather pathetic way, Mrs. Josser distinctly had her uses, and in the result she sat up and ate a good tea. And so did Mrs. Smythe. But not so Mrs. Josser. Having carted the food all the way from Dulcimer Street, she just drank a cup of tea and nibbled at a biscuit and said nothing. It was the first time that she had seen Doreen's mother, and she was having a good look at her. In the result, the study was not half so unsatisfactory as she had anticipated. Admittedly, Mrs. Smythe was smart and well-to-do, with her big pink pearls and a large crocodile skin handbag, and a fur strung over one shoulder. But there was something about Mrs. Smythe, there was something about her that Mrs. Josser detected almost at once. Detected and liked. Underneath all that magnificence, Mrs. Smythe was common. And Mrs. Smythe, taking things more easily, had arrived at her own estimation of Mrs. Josser. There was no point in denying that she cut a pretty unfashionable figure as she sat there. Any woman who cared for her appearance would long ago have changed those grim steel spectacles for something smarter in tortoiseshell or coloured bone. But there was character there, undeniably, and sense. Mrs. Smythe felt more hopeful for the future. Finally, she came over and sat beside Mrs. Josser on the settee that was to be Doreen's bed, as soon as Doreen had decided where she wanted it. "What do you think of this flat?" she asked in a whisper. "I wasn't asked," Mrs. Josser snapped back at her. "But now that you have been, Mrs. Smythe said coaxingly. "Can you tell me? I won't pass it on." "I think it's a mistake," Mrs. Josser said briefly. "A terrible mistake." "Oh, I am glad," Mrs. Smythe answered. "I think it's awful. Do you think they'll be happy here?" "Not if I know them," Mrs. Josser answered. Mrs. Smythe seemed delighted. "I do so agree," she said. "It's what I've been telling Doreen. Is Doris headstrong too?" So-so," Mrs. Josser answered. "And what a time to choose," Mrs. Smythe suddenly said. "Supposing there's a war and they can't live on the top floor, it wouldn't be safe." "Oh dear," Mrs. Josser agreed wearily. "I do hope something goes wrong and they get tired of this flat." "I couldn't agree more," said Mrs. Smythe. "For a start, Doreen isn't strong enough." The headstrong and delicate Doreen had, however, apparently recovered considerably by now. She was going about the flat rearranging things. Shrill shrieks of disappointment or delight indicated that in whichever of the 4 rooms she was at any moment, there was something new to be discovered. "Horrid flat," Mrs. Smythe said suddenly. "So dirty." Mrs. Josser turned on her. "That it isn't," she said. "I scrubbed it myself." "Did you really?" Mrs. Smythe said. "Couldn't you get a woman?" "I didn't try," Mrs. Josser told her. "I just came and did it." It was nearly 6 now, and Mrs. Smythe said that she would have to be going. Doreen put down the 2 lampshades that she was carrying and came forward, open-armed, to hug her mother. It was a demonstrative kind of parting, heavy, and with kisses and promises and squeezes. "You've been an absolute darling, Mummy dear," Doreen told her. "Thank you so much for coming over and doing everything." Mrs. Josser beckoned Doris to come closer. "Here," she said, "you may want this." She handed Doris the basket from which the tea had been produced. Apparently there was still quite a lot in it. "There's half a leg of cold lamb in there," she went on, "and a peach flan. You won't feel like much cooking tonight or tomorrow." Doris caught her eye as she said it. They were not an emotional family, the Jossers, but the Smythes, indeed, Mrs. Joss... What? Sorry, let me do that again. Doris caught her mother's eye. Yes, Doris. I'm getting confused sometimes between Doris and Doreen. Doris caught her mother's eye as she said it. They were not an emotional family, the Jossers. Beside the Smythes, indeed, Mrs. Josser and Doris seemed unnaturally frigid and aloof. But for a moment, mother and daughter smiled at each other, and it was an understanding smile. Mutely, it expressed the simple truth of the situation, that though they might get on each other's nerves to screaming point, if ever they had to live together again, they would miss each other like mad if they were actually separated. Let's have a slurp whilst we get all that. The moving in was now finished, and there was nothing for it but to leave the girls to the discomforts of their new home. They made a very charming pair, Doreen and Doris, as they stood there on the top of the staircase, waving. But the staircase was far too tricky for there to be any waving and turning. Sorry, the staircase was far too tricky for there to be any turning and waving back. Neither Mrs. Smythe or Mrs. Josser was prepared to risk a header, even for the sake of a daughter. "How perfectly awful," Doreen exclaimed as she came back from the front door. "I thought they were never going." Doris looked uncomfortable. For some reason or other, she was suddenly feeling sorry for her mother. Not grateful or dutiful or anything like that, just plain sorry. And she didn't like to hear Doreen saying that she was glad that she had gone away again. "It wouldn't have mattered," she said. "Not mattered?" Doreen shrieked at her. "You must be mad. It would have spoiled everything." As she said it, Doreen came to life again. What she had shown up to now was just a little eddy of energy. But this was the real full hurricane. There was something positively alarming about so much dynamism let loose in such a confined space. She went tearing about from room to room, carrying even quite small things like a cigarette box or a travelling clock, and putting them down somewhere different. But there was a reason for the rush. It was one of those brilliant ideas of Doreen's that had come to her from simply nowhere, hit on the notion of throwing a moving-in party. It wasn't going to be a big affair, she explained to Doris. She wasn't going to take any special trouble over it. All she had done was invite a few of her friends, a few chaps around for a drink. And it was part of a scheme that they would bring the drinks with them. In her enthusiasm, she rattled off again a selection of the fellows that she had invited. There was Tony and Christopher and Donald and Bill and Maurice and Hilary and Bernard. She couldn't stop now. She had to tell Doris everything about them. But they had all said they were absolutely crazy to meet her. There had been a careless generosity about the manner of inviting them, too. They'd all been asked to bring along with them any other chaps who they might happen to be free that evening. In less than a couple of hours' time, it seemed, dozens of unknown men, at least half of them strangers to each other, would be piling into the place. Doris asked Doreen if she would like her to go out and find a shop where she could buy some more food, but Doreen wouldn't hear of it. She said that it was far more important to get the studio, it was the studio now, that she'd decided, or they had decided to call it, looking respectable. In any case, it was drink, not food they'd be wanting, and she told them to bring that with them. So she went on to say that if only they were going to... She went on to say that if only they were on the phone up there, she could have doubled the number that was coming. She must have been mad, quite mad, she decided, to have left out all her oldest friends. There was Hughie and Valentine and Frank and Quintine and a score of others whom she'd only just remembered. By 9 o'clock, one of the multitude had actually turned up. His name was Bill, a quiet, rather serious-looking man, wrapped up in an enormous striped muffler. He came in carrying a quart bottle of beer and saying that he hoped he wasn't late. While they were waiting for the others to arrive, the time passed rather slowly because Bill, though friendly, wasn't much of a conversationalist. Even the best subjects simply died on him. He was a Barts man, a medical in his final year, and the most engaging thing about him was his grin. It appeared suddenly, almost without warning, completely transforming his whole face, and suggested a broad vein of sheer idiocy running somewhere right through him. Doris found herself rather liking Bill, and wondered if all the other men were going to be so nice. In whispers in the kitchen, Doreen promised her far better. Bill was quite a pet in his way, she said, but it was Tony, his best friend, that was the real scream. He ought to be along almost any time now, she said. But she was wrong. Tony didn't come. Nor did the others. Nobody came. By 10:30, there was still only Bill, and by then they had finished the beer that he had brought with him. They waited until 11 to see if there was going to be any chance of anything else to drink, and then Doris suggested that they might have some sort of meal. She produced the leg of lamb and the peach flan that Mrs. Josser had left behind, and between them all, they polished it off. The one who didn't make a hearty meal of it was Doreen. She was too busy explaining. "What a joke," she kept saying. "If only I just remembered. I don't think I gave any of them the new address. If only I could just see their faces. Imagine how you would feel if someone asked you to a party and then moved away without telling you." She was still saying something of the kind when, at midnight, Bill announced that he had to be going. He left, assuring the two girls that he'd had a wonderful time, and disappeared heroically down the iron staircase, his muffler flying. His "cheerio" sounded up from the darkness somewhere from below. "I wonder what will happen to all the others?" Doris asked, as soon as they were alone together. They must have known that it couldn't have been at the old address, if this was a moving-in party. "Oh, them. I'd forgotten about them," Doreen told her. "They were probably drunk anyway. In any case, I shan't speak of them again." "I shan't speak to any of them again," was actually the line. Skilt says we're all woofing down pork chops with green beans, sweet corn and homegrown potatoes covered in salted butter. Well, I should be round. Save some for me. I'm starving. I'm not starving, actually. I had a very nice lunch, in actual fact. But I'm getting peckish now because we're heading towards sort of 5-ish, aren't we? We'll carry on. Percy was depressed again. He shifted the Bentley. No, he hadn't. He'd shifted the Bentley. It was off his hands now. But what have he got out of it? Just half of what they told him. He'd been paid, of course, for the work he'd actually put in, the respraying, the new bumpers, removing the fancy coach lamps, toning down the pretties. But all he'd got for doing the job was just £25 instead of 50. It wasn't good enough, and it hurt. Hurt right down to where it was tenderest. Hurt so much, in fact, that he'd decided to do a bit of lifting on his own account. Freelance. "That's me," he said to himself over and over again, because it was his favourite word by now. "I'm just wasting my time playing with those boys if they don't play fair by me." Not that he was going to do anything silly. He wasn't going to rush things. He was just going to use his head. Stealing a car was a serious job. It needed brain work and planning. Because he was worrying about how he would begin, he stood there biting his nails. It was an old habit that he had retained from childhood. Mrs. Boone had always known just how he was feeling from the way he kept bringing his fingers up to his mouth. He was like that now, leaning up against a petrol pump marked "commercial," and he gnawed away at the quick. The nails of all the garagemen were short enough, anyhow, and he began straightening things out in his mind. For a start, there was no use doing things entirely single-handedly, too risky. If the police were out for stolen cars, they'd go straight away to the man who was driving solo. A couple of people up front was much safer. It looked social too, somehow. It looked too social, somehow, to be involved in crime. If any of them was your grandmother, you'd be able to drive right through a cordon. But supposing your grandmother wouldn't play, who then? Certainly not the blonde. The police knew all about blondes and suspected them. Besides, the blonde might talk. She had never seemed to Percy the intellectual type, and she looked the wrong sort anyhow. Even if she'd been brunette, the police would still have suspected her. What he wanted was a nice, quiet girl with not too much makeup on and not in a fur coat. Fur coats were suspicious too, especially half-length ones with all the tails hanging down. He wanted someone more in the quiet kind. The difficulty was that he didn't know any of that class of girl. They just didn't interest him somehow. Of course, there was Doris, but he was going to keep Doris right out of this. "Your little hands must be kept clean, my darling," he began thinking. "Let Percy do the rough work. You keep yourself all life nice and sweet and lovely for me. I want your little hands clean." For a moment, he peered into the future. He saw himself sitting side by side with Doris on the knoll couch in a good-class drawing-room with a radiogram and a big Chinese vase full of tulips and long velvet curtains up on the pelmets and a pretty maid bringing in a tray of drinks. And when the maid had pranced out of the room again on her high heels, Percy put his arm tighter round Doris and told her his secret. "You remember all those cars I used to collect with you on the Sunday afternoons when we were engaged?" he was saying. "Well, they were all hot, each one of them. We'd have done 3 years, both of us, if I'd been caught." But that was all wrong. That was just what he wasn't going to do. It was dreaming. He always had this bad habit, dreaming. Besides, he'd got it all worked out by now. He was right on the big idea. At this very moment there was someone driving about in a car that wouldn't belong to its owner by tomorrow night. It would belong to Percy Boone, Esquire, hot car specialist, and the way he'd planned it, there wouldn't be any danger, and any real danger, that is. Of course, in all the professions, there's always an element of risk. You can't get rich and play safe at the same time. "Cut it clean out. Don't be a fool. You're playing with playing with fire, Percy." Voice number 2 suddenly spoke inside him. Voice number 2 always broke in about now. It was a dreary, cautioning sort of voice, like it might have been his father's. It warned him against things, not just hot cars, but blondes as well, and places like Charlie's Bar and Smokies, and little things like 50 cigarettes a day and betting on the dogs. Percy didn't know where it came from, but it was always there, ready to say something spoiling, just as he was beginning to enjoy himself. Then voice number 1 clipped in. Voice number 1 was a very different kind of voice, more like some of the voices he'd heard on the films. It was more like Edward G. Robinson voice that made you sit up, and the advice it gave was different too. "So, you're backing out, are you?" it asked. "You're content with things as they are? You haven't got any ambition? You want to stay a garage hand?" Voice number 1 paused for a moment, almost as if taking a deep breath. Then it fairly bawled into his ear. "Go on and do it. You're ladies' man. So show you've got the guts. Let 'em know who's the clever one around here." It was funny having these 2 voices in him all the time, trying to make him move in different directions at once. No wonder he had headaches. And where did it come from, he wondered? Which of them was the real him? Or wasn't he either of them? Was he just the one that did the listening? In any case, he couldn't help hearing because the voices were right inside him, and voice number 1 was so loud, right against his ear, and it did something to him, too. It was voice number 1 that had urged him on to handle the hot Bentley. It was voice number 1 that told him to go after blondes, and it reminded him that if he didn't, somebody else would. It was voice number 1 that told him to be a freelance and use his head. It was voice number 1 that led Percy into a lot of trouble. But now it was helping him fix up the details of the first little job on his own account. "Easy as falling off a log, if you use your head properly," it was saying. "All it needs is timing. Pick your moment. Don't force things. And look out for a nice lock-up somewhere off the beaten track. Don't go too fancy. Don't go too high. Choose something that the cops won't turn round to stare at. Then you'll be all right. Make it a Morris or an Austin, and Bob's your uncle." "And what about your poor old mum, if you slip up somewhere?" Voice number 2 said as soon as voice number 1 had finished. "Have you thought about her?" Just a slight pause. We come to the end of that section. Mary and Hammond. Sorry I'm late. We'll creep in at the back. Mary, Hammond. Da 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 da. Yep. Is Percy sycophantic? Schizophrenic? Yes, he could be. Shush down at the back. Connie was downstairs seeing Mrs. Vizard. Mrs. Vizard hadn't asked her to sit down, and Connie stood there on the hearthrug, twinning her little yellow fingers, or twinning her little fingers in embarrassment. "I've done my best," she said, "and that's the most anyone can do." She gave a little sniff that turned into something like a sob before it was finished, and held out 3 half-crowns in her hand to Mrs. Vizard. "All I could raise," she added. "The widow's mite." Mrs. Vizard had been prepared for this. She made no attempt to take the money. "I told you before," she said. "It's not your money I want, it's the room." She paused. "And I want it by tonight. You know that." "I could pay off the other 2 weeks bit by bit, if you wouldn't mind waiting," Connie suggested. "6pence a week would clear it up by Christmas. Then we could all start fair and square again, the way I like things." Mrs. Vizard did not waver. "You're wasting your time, Connie," she told her. There was a silence between them, broken only by the quick sound of Connie's breathing. "And what about my feelings?" she suddenly asked. "They're your affair. And supposing I won't?" "Won't what?" "Won't go." Mrs. Vizard drew herself up. As she was always a bolt-upright ramrod of a woman, this only meant that she raised her chin a little higher, but it was enough. It gave her just that extra bit of confidence that was needed to ensure that the whole situation didn't get out of hand and become vulgar. A row with a lodger would have been unspeakably degrading. "Don't be silly, Connie," she said. "You'll go if I tell you to go." "I wouldn't be so sure if I were you," Connie answered. "I'm not." There was another silence, but not a complete one. Connie was humming now. "If you don't go of your own free will," Mrs. Vizard said in a low, steady voice, "I will have you put out." "Meaning the police?" "Meaning the—" As she came to the word, Mrs. Vizard checked herself. It was something that she didn't like to hear from her own lips. That single word stood for everything that was sordid and unpleasant in life. "Meaning exactly that," she corrected herself. Connie stopped humming. "They'll be needed," was all she said. Somewhere in the back of one of the sideboard drawers was a little book, The Law of Landlord and Tenant. Why hadn't she reread it in preparation for this kind of thing? Mrs. Vizard asked herself, memorised it even. Then, sorry, I was just working out which one was saying that, but clearly it was Mrs. Vizard. Somewhere in the back of one of the sideboard drawers was a little book, The Law of the Landlord and Tenant. Why hadn't she reread it in preparation for this kind of thing, Mrs. Vizard asked herself, memorised it even. She had studied it carefully enough when she'd bought it, but it had been her first primer in self-supporting widowhood, in fact. But ever since then, it had lain there, unread and unneeded. There was one chapter entitled Rights of the Landlord that had been specially written to help with people who were being difficult. "If assistance has to be sent for," she said at last in the same steady voice, "that's only the end so far as the landlord is concerned. You'll be in an awful possession of... You'll have been in unlawful possession of premises, and you'll have to bear the consequences. And if you try to resist arrest..." "What about my squatter's rights?" Connie demanded. "I've seen my solicitor, and he says..." Then Mrs. Vizard did a bold thing. She took up her hat from the chair where she had laid it and went over to the mirror. "I'm going to the police station now," she said. Police station. The horrid word had slipped out despite herself. "See you when you get back," said Connie. "You'll see more than me," Mrs. Vizard answered. "It's the 3rd floor at the back, you can tell 'em," Connie advised Mrs. Vizard. The one with the locked door. Mrs. Vizard's hands shook visibly as she thrust back the strand of her hair. And while you're down there, tell them to bring an axe with them, because this door will be locked and it'll stay locked. They'll know what to do without me telling them, Mrs. Vizard replied over her shoulder. You bet they will, Connie answered. It's just what flatties love, smashing up other people's property. It won't be the only door that gets broken if I have anything to do with them. There's furniture in the room too. Do you want to get yourself handcuffed? Mrs. Vizard asked, her voice raising a little as she said it. Now she really had been low and outspoken. She had threatened. Threatened, but not intimidated. Connie gave a little laugh. You've got it, she said. Handcuffed and carried, if they can hold me. You can't tell 'em. You can tell 'em from me I'm a struggler. I'll scream too, if they don't put a gag on me. Tell 'em that from Auntie. Mrs. Vizard picked up her gloves and began slowly thrusting her fingers into them. The movements were not so rapid now, and she appeared to be thinking. It'll be a scene all right when it happens, Connie went on. If I were you, I would stop out for it, and if any of the others give you notice on account of the noise, you'll only have yourself to thank for it. There'll be a crowd outside before I'm finished. When I start screaming, people hear me. They'll remember the day that little Connie said goodbye to number 10. Mrs. Vizard was motionless. Her left glove, it was black shiny kid, was half on, and she made no movement to draw it further. Then, abruptly, she pulled it off again and turned to face Connie. If I let you stop, will you have learnt your lesson? She asked. By heart, Connie answered contritely. And there won't be any more of these goings-on? Not likely, said Connie. If you were in my place, would you? Very well, Mrs. Vizard told her. This time we'll agree to overlook it, but you have been warned, remember? Then I can stop? Mrs. Vizard bowed her head. Bless your dear kind heart, Connie said complacently. You've done your good deed all right for today. She turned and started for the door. And may you never regret it more than I shall, she added. And what, Mrs. Vizard asked, about the 7 and 6? Outside, Connie paused and drew a deep breath. Saved again by the 11th hour, she told herself. Then she remembered the 7th and 6th, and she shook her head. Dear kind heart, nothing. 1 pound of flesh, please, and I want it by lunchtime. That's more her mark. Then she smiled. It wasn't really so serious even about the 7 and 6. After all, Mr. Josser had given her a full 3 weeks. And she supposed that she was really one of the lucky ones, lucky to have a roof over her head and a bit on the side to see her through this little bit of trouble. She got out of that one, didn't she? She got out of that one. Oh, good old Connie. You gotta love these characters, haven't you? We're coming slowly now to the end of the first, what's called the first book. I don't know how many books there are. There's 7 books and a postscript. Mr. Josser had got himself another job. Tired of his retirement, he was now a rent collector. And after 4.5 months of doing nothing, it was like emerging from the gloom of the chrysalis into the full sunlight to realise that he was a free man no longer. Because he'd only had the job for the last 3/4 of an hour, he was excited as well as pleased. Pleased that he should have got the job at all, when London was full of old clerks, all of them wanting something part-time, something not too strenuous, and so excited that he wanted to tell somebody. Admittedly, there had been wire pulling and a word or two from the... Oh, I see what they mean. Sorry, I had to think about that. Admittedly, there'd been wire pulling and a word or two on the side to help him. The Undersecretary of the Colonies had spoken to the First Sea Lord in his civil capacity, of course, and that had fixed it. But influence or not, the simple fact remained that he had been interviewed by strangers and found worthy. That was what was bothering him. After all these years at Battlebury's, Mr. Josser hadn't really known what the outside world would have to say about employing him. He was still bubbling over with his new importance when he got back to Dulcimer Street. £1 a week the job was going to bring in, and coming on top of a couple of pounds he was drawing as a pension, that made £3. It was as much as he'd got married on. And there had been the children as well to bring up. At the thought of the bright future, the roseate prospect of the ensuring years, Mr. Josser began whistling. He was still whistling when he got out his door key and went inside. And stepped right into the middle of a crisis. It was Baby who was at the centre of it. In perfect health and high spirits at breakfast, she had been sulky and fretful by lunch, and by tea-time spots had appeared. And Cynthia, silly little giggling Cynthia, who looked too young to be a mother anyhow, had lost her head at the sight of them. She had rung Ted up at the Co-op, thereby interrupting its important retail affairs, and Ted, like the sensible fellow he was, had come straight round to his mother as soon as the stores had closed. He was sitting there now, morose and preoccupied. The effect on Mrs. Josser, however, was magical. She responded to a crisis as if to a tonic. It braced and stimulated her. There was passing flattery in the implicit acknowledgement of the fact that even a small child nearly 3 miles away in Balham couldn't come out in a rash without her being sent for. And now, in her new role of indispensableness, Mrs. Josser became dictatorial and overbearing. She told Ted point blank that if there was any serious illness in the house, the best thing that she could do was to keep out of her way for the time being. This was an affair for Cynthia and herself, she said. Illness, particularly sudden illness of little children, it seemed, was something far too big for any man, with the exception of the doctor, to get mixed up with. So she began insisting that Ted should stop on at number 10 for a meal, while she went over to Lakespur Road herself. There was nothing, she explained, more upsetting for a woman when there was illness in a house than to have a man hanging around wanting a meal, or, worse still, getting it himself. In times of sickness, the whole sex, in Mrs. Josser's eyes, became superfluous. And to prove its uselessness, she started to get a meal ready for her 2 waifs before leaving. She was away for only about 5 minutes, but when she returned, she had her hat on already and carried a loaded tray. Having placed it before them, she refused to eat anything herself. She seemed indeed shocked at the suggestion that she, a woman, would even think of eating at a time like this. Instead, she shot straight off, carrying a shopping bag containing a thermometer in a little metal case, 3 OXO cubes, and a box of nightlights, a Sedalitz powder, and a packet of cotton wool. There was always a tendency on Mrs. Josser to part. There was always a tendency on Mrs. Josser's part to dramatise these occasions. Ted was the first to speak after Mrs. Josser had gone. "I don't know that Cynthia'll be very pleased to see Mum if she's expecting me," she said. I thought of that, Mr. Josser answered. Ever since he'd got back, he felt like a man who sees an avalanche descending without having been able to warn the people down the valley below. But it wouldn't have been any good trying to stop her, he added. No use at all. After that, they ate in silence for a moment. Then Ted spoke again. Spots are dangerous, aren't they? He asked. It hadn't occurred to him until that moment that they might be, but something of Mrs. Josser's reaction now spread through to him. He was a great pal of baby's, and he couldn't bear to think of anything happening to her while he was just sitting there eating. But Mr. Josser reassured him. You both had 'em, he said, and you got over them. After that conversation had died away again, even when the cheese course was reached and Mr. Josser lifted the floral china lid of the dish, he just shook his head. Under the strain of emotion, he'd already been unusually eloquent, and he was back to his normal self again. He was thinking of the affairs of the department. They'd been 2 shillings and 6pence short at the cash desk. Oh, this is Ted who's thinking like this. There'd been 2 shillings and 6pence short at the cash desk when he had come away, and he was wondering if they would find it. Mr. Josser cleared his throat. It was the postponed moment that he had been waiting for. I'm going back into harness, he said. Start again next Monday, 3 days a week. Ted showed no astonishment. All that he revealed was a certain calm apprehension. Oh, what does Mum say to that? She doesn't know yet, Mr. Josser admitted. Ted paused. Is your chest strong enough? He inquired. Oh, yes, my chest is all right, he said. The doctor says so. As he spoke, he raised a hand automatically and felt the pad of thermogene that he always wore there. Whatever is thermogene? There was another pause. What is the job? Ted asked at last. Mr. Josser told him. When Ted didn't say anything, didn't even ask how much the job was worth, Mr. Josser felt rather hurt. But Ted was hurt too. He supposed that it was because his parent was hard up that he'd done this thing, and that had hurt him even, and that had made him silent more than ever. He thought for a long time before he said anything. Is this because Doris has gone? He asked at last. Oh, no, said Mr. Josser emphatically. It's got nothing to do with that. It's not because of Doris. Ted thought again. Is she still allowing you anything? He asked. It was the first time he had ever actually asked it this way. Family finance was always a delicate matter, and ever since the conference that had been held when Battlebriz had decided to pension his father off, he hadn't referred to it again. It had been agreed then that he should give them 10 shillings a week, and that Doris should contribute £1 to live at home. On any showing, she had probably been a dead loss from the start, but it had sounded fair enough at the time. And Ted simply hadn't inquired about what allowance she was making now that she had left the home. It hadn't seemed any of his business, but now abruptly he saw it in a new light. Just because she had chosen to set herself up fancy in a fancy flat somewhere, his father, her father too for that matter, had to go out to work again. It wasn't good enough, and he was determined to talk to her about it. But Mr. Josser was looking at him in disguise. Doris? He asked. She wants to give Mother 5 shillings a week, but I won't let her. Mr. Josser paused. It's not fair, he went on. A girl paying out like that and getting nothing. Sorry, I'm a bit confused here. Doris, he asked. She wants to give Mother 5 shillings a week. I won't let her. Mr. Josser paused. "It's not fair," he went on. "A girl paying out like that and getting nothing for it." "Well, I'm going on," Ted said sullenly. "Oh, I see. So in other words, Doris wants to give her mum, for board and lodgings, a contribution to the house, even though she's living in the flat." Sorry, I didn't quite twig that. That's what it means. So that's why Mr. Josser says it's not fair. A girl paying out like that and getting nothing for it because she's not living at home. "Well, I'm going on," says Ted, referring to his 10 shillings that he contributes to his mum and dad, even though they don't live at home. I've clocked that now. Sometimes, the brain is a bit thick. Mr. Josser played with his pipe, fondling the warm bowl in the palm of his hand. "No, you're not, son," he said. "I've had it quite long enough. Time to stand on my own feet now." "We'll see," Ted told him. Mr. Josser rubbed his hands together. "We haven't touched our capital, that's one comfort," he said. And then they both sat there, Mr. Josser on one side of the fire, not saying very much, and Ted on the other side, not saying anything at all. At 8:30, when the clock struck its sombre Westminster chime, Ted got up and said that he'd have to be going. It had been an unsettling kind of evening. It was not until nearly 11 that Mrs. Josser returned. She looked tired and put on about something. "How were they?" he inquired. "How was what?" Mrs. Josser asked irritably. "The spots." "Gone," Mrs. Josser told him. "Not a trace. Must have been something she'd eaten. Either that or Cynthia imagined them." In the circumstances, Mr. Josser decided that it would be better to wait till later to say anything about his new job. And that is the end of that section. I'm glad we managed to get to the end of that. Sorry about reading so dreadfully towards the end as I was trying to work it out. But anyway, that's the end of book 1. We get to book 2 tomorrow. That is called The Crime on the Common. And it starts off with chapter 16. You can't leave them there, Mr. Derrick. Thermogene, a form of medicated wadding pinned inside clothes to treat rheumatism, lumbago, and so on. Oh, there we are, David Vad. Thank you very much for that. How superb. Thank you very much for joining me today. I shall be back again tomorrow, and we will get into the book 2, the Crime on the Common, chapter 16. Thank you very much to Mary for sending in the da-da-bum, ba-da-da-da-bum. And there's a yellow one to go with it. Thank you very much. And Mary, the cheque is in the post. Just before I came on air, I rushed to the supermarket that has a post box in it, and I've posted the cheque to you. So hopefully you'll get that tomorrow with a first-class stamp. So thank you very much. A wonderful book so far. Thank you, Richard, says Turbo Stream. There we go. Oh, my goodness, says Anne H. And buy many. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. Nice to see you. Look after yourselves. I will see you tomorrow. All good fun, isn't it? All good fun. Till then, arrivederci. Arrivederci. Remove your dentures. Arrivederci. Remove your dentures. There you go. Ta-ta and goodbye. Thank you very much. Have a nice evening. See you tomorrow.